I'm very pleased to be joined by Village Voice reporter Tom Robbins, longtime keen observer of politics in New York City. Welcome to CityWide.
Good to be here, Ken.
I'm going to open by asking you the same question that I asked Isaac Devore from City Hall newspaper recently. A year ago, I was pretty certain that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president of the United States, having the strong support of Governor Eliot Spitzer, although some people thought that he might have been a touch too critical of AIG's and Wall Street's accounting. What happened?
Two-part question, right? Clinton, we can sort of come to an answer on that. Eliot Spitzer, I don't think we'll ever understand. His shrink will have to tell us that question. I mean, that was the most dramatic and sudden downfall of any politician in my time in New York. Matched only maybe by this week's arrest by Governor Blagojevich over in Illinois. But the Clinton thing, I think that you could see that coming. I mean, I think that a lot of people in New York, because they were quite rightfully cheering for the hometown gal, saw her as the front runner, as did much of the national press. But she carried the highest negatives of any candidate among independent voters. They never went under 50%, which anybody will tell you is an extraordinarily high piece of baggage to carry. And you would see that carry out throughout the campaign in terms whenever she left the northeastern area, whenever she left her the hub of Clinton home politics and went out in the hustings. And if you saw Barack Obama, I went to see him for the first time in the early summer of 2007 when he showed up in Brooklyn at the Marriott Hotel. And there were 3,000 people in the room. There was another 600 people waiting online outside all the way to the Brooklyn Bridge. They couldn't get in. And it was raining. They stood in the rain waiting to get in. And inside that room, he had them bouncing off the walls. And I'd never seen anything like it. And it was an interesting phenomenon to observe my own colleagues in the press because they were there to see whether or not Obama took shots at Hillary Clinton. And nobody could, he didn't, you know, he just played it as straight as he could. But I saw something I'd never seen in a politician before, and I came out of there and I said, you know what, I think that this guy can actually do it. And he continued to do it. I think New Yorkers missed that for a long time. The Times was the worst offender. The Times refused to give Obama coverage until after he was far ahead in the polls, and then they started jumping on the bandwagon. But I think that Hillary's downfall was foreseeable.
Is he a transformative figure?
He's a transformative figure. Whether or not he can transform the nation's politics is a question. But I was out in Ohio during the November election, and I kept looking. I was in northern Ohio, just west of Cleveland, in an industrial area. And at the polls, I kept going and looking for McCain voters. Look, people who came out, I thought, this guy must have voted for McCain and Palin. Let me try to get a reading out of them. And I kept being surprised by my own assumptions. People would tell me that they had watched all of the debates, that they were fascinated by his performance, that they thought he was incredibly competent. This is a guy who I think trumps all of the usual assumptions about politics.
How does that play out in New York now? So, and I want to ask in terms of race relations, in terms of the fact that the Democratic Party here wasn't hugely behind Obama. The center of gravity may have shifted to Chicago. What does it mean in New York that Obama is going to be the president?
Well, Hillary Clinton is going to be Secretary of State. That's the biggest single change. I mean, it means a game of musical chairs for an untold number of politicians that are going to be looking to either move up one or change seats from where they are. And I think that there is also hope for urban centers like New York that there was not for the last 8 years. And even during the Clinton years, when Clinton did not have the muscle in Congress to be able to deliver on that to Democrats in urban areas. I think for the first time we could see a real urban agenda coming out of Washington. So that's the biggest single piece, I think.
In fact, almost an explicit repudiation of anti-city rhetoric. Rudy Giuliani at the Republican convention criticizing Democrats for criticizing Sarah Palin as not being cosmopolitan enough, and the country didn't seem to care about that.
Rudy's trying to make fun of him for being make fun of Obama for being a community organizer, as he said, which I think has come back to backfire against him. And if he runs for governor, which I guess he wants to do at this point, I think that's going to bother him again.
Do you think that there's a permanent shift towards the Democrats? Is this one of these generational changes? Is the Reagan Revolution over?
I don't know. I'm not, look, I'm very parochial, Ken. I'm here in New York. For me, a trip to Ohio is a big deal. Getting over to Hudson County is a big deal. But New York, I think that the biggest change that we've seen post-November has been the change in the state Senate. I mean, that's where Democrats now have taken the majority for the first time.
Although they don't seem to be able to organize it very well.
Go ahead, you can say it better than me. I mean, it's really, you talk about tripping yourselves up. I mean, here these guys have been handed the golden opportunity they've said that they've been waiting for all these years, and yet they can't seem to get out of a room together, each saying the same thing about what happened inside the room. We've got a Democratic governor, we've got a Democratic leader in the Assembly, we probably will have a Democratic leader in the Senate. We'll see whether or not they can all work together.
How do you think David Paterson's been doing? He resents being called the accidental governor. In some ways, he, at least according to the Committee on Rumors, thought that he might wind up in the U.S. Senate if Hillary became the president. Now he gets to pick the United States Senator, assuming that she's confirmed. But also he's been out there as a Paul Revere on the economic situation for months now, sounding some pretty not conservative in the political sense, but fiscally conservative rhetoric. Has he been a good governor so far, and what do you think are the big challenges for him in the beginning of the new year?
Well, one of the things that David Paterson did that I thought was astonishing was when he went down to Washington last month and started quoting the great conservative writer Ayn Rand to Congress about how economies should be dealt with. I mean, this is a guy who is trying to rewrite his history as fast as he can. He was a very progressive legislator from Harlem, ably represented his district there. Just a few years ago, he was one of the most vocal advocates to try to stanch then the fiscal crisis by creating what they now call the millionaire's tax. And he said that that was the most equitable way to deal with it. Now he won't discuss those things. It's not on the agenda. He said that that would backfire and that would hurt the economy. He's in a terrible spot. I mean, you really almost have to feel for the guy. I don't think that he had either the training or the staff to be able to step into this role, or even the ambition. And so he's been handed an impossible task, or nearly impossible task. And to some extent, he's done very well in terms of being able to keep editorial boards' support and popular support for what he's doing. That said, I don't think he's been tested yet. I mean, both the special sessions of the legislature that came back to try to answer the fiscal gap went nowhere. So we're going to have to wait until January to see whether or not he can begin to fill the gap there.
We touched earlier on the Spitzer debacle, the arrest of the governor of Illinois. It seems to me there have been an awful lot of scandals lately involving elected officials, United States senators, one convicted recently from Alaska. At one point, we had the governor of New Jersey under a cloud, actually two governors under different kinds of clouds, the governor of Connecticut being convicted of a crime, the state controller, Alan Hevesy, forced out, convicted of a crime, Spitzer leaving under a cloud, and more members of the state legislature than I can count, including the head of the Central Labor Council and the Brooklyn County leader. But there doesn't seem to be a sense of outrage that, other than pundits and professional advocacy organizations, there doesn't seem to be any grassroots movement to address corruption. I mean, I'm not talking about the let's kill all the lobbyists rhetoric that came out of the presidential campaign, but in terms of the kind of reform movements that New York was famous for in the 60s and 70s. Where's the sense of outrage?
Well, I think that you raise a really good question, but I think that the outrage gets sublimated. I mean, I think that people walk around with a deep anger and ever deeper mistrust of government and of politicians as a result of what happened. Look, it's interesting to see how Obama copes with this scandal. Obviously, this is his hometown governor. These are people that he knew. And it wouldn't be surprising to see his name surface at some point directly, maybe even caught up in some conversation that they had these wires up on. If Barack Obama brought hope to millions of Americans and New Yorkers who had not believed that a black person could be elected president, this is probably the sharpest setback to that hope agenda that he set. I think that we only see those kinds of movements within small localities. I mean, in New York City, in the era of the Jimmy Walker regime. We had the reaction by the good government groups who managed to hold their own hearings and be able to drum out some of the most corrupt politicians. Here in New York, in the wake of the Manus scandal of the 1980s, we had the FERC Good Government Commission, which came in and looked at that. To a large extent, those emerged from the force of both the pundits, the editorialists, I believe, and the people who pay attention. It's not so much the people in the street, but it's clear that they were answering this kind of anger that is, I think, subliminal, but is out there.
Well, do you think that we've had, 30, 40 years of relentless media coverage, not just in terms of commentary, but also in terms of popular culture, TV shows, et cetera, that have lowered our expectations of politicians? In other words, people assume that they're all a bunch of crooks anyway, so nobody gets excited when another one gets arrested.
No, I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, there certainly is room for cynicism, and everything that's happened so far would seem to support that. But I think that the Obama election goes counter to that. I think that this is the top office. This is the thing that people most cared about. And that was one of the things I thought that Obama was different from Clinton, was that he offered this question of change and hope. As vague as it was, it answered a need that people had. And so I think that people are still hopeful, and that they are still, if not optimistic, on a national level, and maybe pessimistic on a local level, that they're hoping that some of that is going to trickle down and affect them locally.
We will continue our conversation with Tom Robbins right after this.
Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys are much too much. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We got the spirit. We're hot. We can't be stopped. We're going to beat them and bust them.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life.
Let's get a little bit rowdy. R-O-W-D-Y.
Take time to be a dad
One more
today.
time. Oh, those boys are much too much. Those boys.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Village Voice reporter Tom Robbins. Before the break, you touched on some of scandals of years past. One thing I noticed was that a lot of the local legislators that have been brought to the dock recently have done so by Michael Garcia, the United States Attorney for the Southern District, has just announced that he's going to be leaving office, Democratic president coming in. He has brought any number of public corruption investigations, but he seems to have passed without a footprint in terms of the media scene, in sharp contrast to Rudy Giuliani, who prosecuted Donald Manus, prosecuted Stanley Friedman, the other county leader. Manus sadly committed suicide before he could be charged. Giuliani had a very conscious strategy of using the media to put pressure on the politicians, but also to raise his own status and position himself to run for mayor.
It was the best thing that ever happened to journalists.
Yeah, and certainly for the Village Voice, it worked out. Do you think that prosecutors should be beating the bully pulpit? They're the ones that would seem to have the most intimate knowledge of how deep the corruption actually goes.
To tell you the truth, I'm surprised that they don't do it as much. I think that Giuliani's excesses now, in hindsight, many people, including myself, who was a supporter of the aggressive tack that he took both in politics and on Wall Street and other places, now I look with a lot more skepticism at these self-appointed protectors of our, I think Eliot Spitzer's another example of that, as he was an Attorney General. But I do think that there is a bully pulpit, and I do think that it could be pounded some more. A few years ago, Robert Morgenthau, the district attorney for New York, after having brought a very large tangled case that had to do with all of the maintenance companies for the biggest cooperative buildings and other big apartment buildings in the city, gave a speech, and he called New York Kickback City. And it was a moment when I thought, oh, look at this. At last, like someone is actually sort of putting all this together, other than journalists and other than editorial writers, and trying to say there's an endemic problem here, and basically trying to address the body politic in a way that you don't hear at a Abney breakfast or someplace. He was really trying to say, you guys have got to get a handle on this. I think that prosecutors could do more of that. Garcia was friendly to the cameras. but not aggressive to the cameras. And some of those cases sort of fell into his lap. He was not U.S. attorney for that long a period of time. Some of them were underway before he got there, and he was the beneficiary of earlier investigations. But I think that the public benefits from having prosecutors who say, look, this is endemic to what's going on and we need to do something about it.
And even they can be, at least peripherally, drawn into that kind of culture. We read recently that Congressman Rangel from Harlem has a meeting with a potential donor to a center being named after him, arranged with the district attorney present at breakfast, and then when that breakfast was over, Rangel goes over to the next table, and there is that company's lobbyist talking about a particular tax break. But New York operates on commissions. Why would politics be any different? Whether it's insurance, real estate, stockbrokers, everybody gets paid. In advertising agencies, only if there's a transaction.
Where's my commission? I'm waiting for that. All right.
The mayor of the city of New York, in part, was elected because people thought he couldn't be bought. Do you think Mike Bloomberg is immune from all of this?
I think he's obviously immune from the gross, grasping greed that you see as portrayed on these tapes from the governor of Illinois and from some of these other smaller local cases where you've seen guys like Assemblyman from Queens, Tony Seminario, who is caught telling people that I need to get mine, essentially. Mike Bloomberg has his. He's got somewhere between 10 and $20 billion. He had 20, I think, post-crisis. Now he may only have half of that, but he doesn't need any more money. But power is just as much of a narcotic as money, and we did see Michael Bloomberg do something, as other people pointed out in the last couple of months, when he turned around and decided he wanted a third term, despite two popular referendums that put a two-term limit on citywide and elected city officials.
Do you think that coverage of Bloomberg has been sufficiently critical in the media? Do you think that he's gotten a free ride because he tends to be so low-key that the type of digging into the operations of the agencies, and there's just sort of an assumption that anybody that works from Bloomberg is doing a good job, and then occasionally is, some kind of...
I think that last part really puts your finger on it. I mean, there's been some very good coverage of how he operates as a manager. I mean, when the Times followed him from his home on the east side to the subways and pointed out that he was actually riding in an SUV before he got to the train, and then he was being picked up on the other side. That was pretty good coverage. I like that. They actually shadowed the mayor for many days in order to do that. But the last part of what you just said, which is the agencies. I mean, this is where historically New York City has always had a problem in terms of politically favored people who get a hold and either run amok or simply just run an incompetent operation. And I think there we've all been incredibly not good at doing the daily digging that needs to be done. It's hard work. And this comes at the same time that every newspaper, my own included, is cutting back on the amount of staff and the amount that they're willing to do for investigations. Usually it takes a scandal to try to get the big media to start focusing on those agencies again. Hopefully we're not going to get there, but it could.
Do you get the opportunity these days to do those, long, in-depth pieces? The Times still has them, but they don't seem to be as frequent. And a lot of the emphasis in political journalism these days is on the blogs. It's short items, instant, snarky to a large extent, as opposed to sort of hard-hitting in depth. Do people even want to read the long pieces anymore?
I would hope that they do. I feel exactly as you just described, is that I do not understand the reason why this industry is tilting more towards repeating everyone else's story. We've become an echo chamber to a large extent. One person writes one thing and it gets picked up by 20 different times before even an hour has passed, and this seems to be what people want, including editors. I think that big investigative pieces are the nuts and bolts of good journalism, going back to the greatest practitioners of this business, that this is the stuff that really makes government sit up and pay attention, and that is the only firewall between public abuse and the public. And to the extent that people don't get the time to do it, I think that we suffer from that. They have me doing at The Voice a weekly column these days, plus items on the web to try to stay in touch with everything's going on. I miss the longer pieces. I enjoy the weekly column, and I do as much investigations as I can on that. But I know from my colleagues at other newspapers that this is a common complaint these days, is that they don't get the time to be able to really dig in and sort of set up shop and try to take apart agencies or operations the way that those pieces can do.
So Mike Bloomberg has switched his position on term limits. He's holding back on property tax rebates. He alienated people in the outer boroughs with proposal over congestion pricing, but nonetheless his approval ratings are still very high. He's got that $10 to $20 billion, and he's an incumbent. So and he also had the support of 3 editorial boards in calling for a change in the term limits law. So is it a layup for him to get reelected?
Not anymore. I think that just since November, when this change was made into law, his numbers have come down a little bit. Yesterday, Bill Thompson set up a website, surprised a lot of people, myself included, by coming out very tough on Bloomberg and at least making the early indications that he intends to wage a significant campaign, and with not pulling punches. I think if Thompson can transform himself into a credible candidate with the fire in the belly that he complains that sometimes he's seen as not having, I think that he could certainly be a tough candidate in a race. Could he beat Mike Bloomberg in a general election? You know, the guy spent upwards of $80 million twice now in 2 elections, and that was his argument, was he needed to do that because nobody knew who he was. Now, you know, he's as well known as the Brooklyn Bridge. Everybody knows who Mike Bloomberg is, but he's gonna spend that money to try to basically crush anybody who comes against it. It makes him very hard to beat.
Who do you think the next generation of leadership in New York is? Who are the stars that we should be keeping our eyes on, or who do you think are the biggest rogues that people should be worried about?
Rogues? That's a longer list. You know, there's some people I thought who did a terrific job in standing up to the mayor in this term limits battle. I thought that Bill de Blasio, who if he can stay focused on one thing, he now says he wants to run for public advocate. Let's hope he's made up his mind, and that's what he wants to do. I think he's clearly somebody who has both the personal sense about himself to be a popular official as well as potential mayor, and I think that his colleague Tish James, who stood with him, is also somebody like that. Eric Gioia, councilman from Queens, who I think has been very smart in terms of using his office and parlaying it into a big campaign war chest. He also wants to run for public advocate. I think there are people from the current class, what would have been the outgoing class of council members, who could step up. But none of them have really been tested. I mean, being a council member, as you know, is not the same thing as being an executive who has to make decisions.
Well, my thanks to Village Voice reporter Tom Robbins for being on the show, keeping those politicians honest. And thank you for joining us on this edition of CityWide. I'm Ken Fisher.